I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch network. A pretty big story over the weekend from the Washington Post about how Mark Meadows, Donald Trump's former chief of staff, was sending private text messages basically mocking Donald Trump's claims of election fraud. And if you've been a viewer of the MeidasTouch network, this story, which was billed as major breaking news by the Washington Post, would not be big breaking news to you, because remember, we told you back when the January 6th committee was gathering evidence how big these text messages are. Let's just go right to the source before going to Washington Post to remind you of these text messages that Mark Meadows was sending and receiving with a White House lawyer at the time. This was right before the January 6th phone call that Donald Trump had with Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, where Donald Trump threatened Raffensperger, find me the 11,780 votes or else. But even though Mark Meadows coordinated that call between Donald Trump and Brad Raffensperger, Mark Meadows was privately mocking Donald Trump in these text messages. And so the one thing to note here as well is that Mark Meadows' son, Blake Meadows, is an attorney, and Blake Meadows, at the time of the aftermath of the 2020 election, when Donald Trump was making all of these false statements about election fraud, Blake Meadows was actually working with the Trump campaign to investigate these allegations. And so Blake Meadows knew that Donald Trump's accusations of voter fraud was just completely and totally false, and he had been trying to determine if there were dead voters in Georgia. That was absolutely not the case. I think they found 12 people who had passed away since the general election. But let's just go to the source before reading and going over this Washington Post article. So here it is right here. These are the messages between Mark Meadows and a top White House lawyer right around January 6th of 2021. It says, just an FYI, Alex Cannon and his team verified that the 10,000 supposed dead people voting in Georgia is not accurate. So the fact that Mark Meadows and the top White House lawyer are recognizing that this claim that was being advanced by Donald Trump and frankly by Meadows, that there was 10,000 dead people voting, was not verified. Goes on to say, I didn't hear that claim. It is not accurate. I think I found 22, if I remember correctly. 2 of them died just days before the general. And then the response was, it was alleged in Rudy's hearing today, your number is much closer to what we can prove. I think it's 12. Again, these messages are coming from Mark Meadows. And so as Mark Meadows is advancing the big lie on behalf of Donald Trump privately, this is what Mark Meadows is saying. And then Mark Meadows responds, my son, referring to Blake Meadows, my son found 12 obituaries and 6 other possibles depending on the voter roll accuracy. And then the White House lawyer says, that sounds more like it. Maybe he can help Rudy find the other 10,000. And then Mark Meadows responds, LOL. The fact that they're mocking Trump like this, but they also find it a joke, right? Like maybe your son, Mark, can help find the other 10,000 votes. And by the way, language that Donald Trump used, right? When he spoke to Brad Raffensperger, Georgia Secretary of State, what did Trump say? Find me 11,780 votes. And here, privately, they're mocking Donald Trump, but they're making a mockery out of our entire democracy right here, joking that Rudy Giuliani, who's working on behalf of the Trump campaign, is just making false allegations that there are 10,000 dead people that voted, and they know it's a lie. So this is critical because it goes to intent. And by the way, it goes to Donald Trump's intent. And by the way, these messages were produced in connection with the January 6th committee, right? So we've talked about these Mark Meadows text messages before. So I found it somewhat curious, although I think it demonstrates that Special Counsel Jack Smith's team is focused on it. That adds to it that the Washington Post billed this as like they got a scoop or they got an exclusive. By the way, Washington Post has done some great reporting, but this right here I don't think is a scoop, and I don't think they really acknowledge that these messages were out before and that we've talked about them here. This is the Washington Post article. It says, before January 6th, Mark Meadows joked about Trump's election claims. In a text, Meadows wrote that his own son was unable to find more than a handful of votes potentially cast in the name of dead voters. People familiar with the messages say. The article goes on to say, Mark Meadows joked about the baseless claim that large numbers of voters were fraudulently cast in the names of dead people in the days before the then White House Chief of Staff participated in a phone call in which Donald Trump alleged there were close to 5,000 dead voters in Georgia, and urged Brad Raffensperger, Georgia Secretary of State, to overturn the 2020 election. In a text message that has been scrutinized by federal prosecutors, Mark Meadows wrote to a White House lawyer that his son, Atlanta area attorney Blake Meadows, had been probing a possible fraud and had found only a handful of possible votes cast in dead voters' names, far short of what Trump was alleging. The lawyer teasingly responded that perhaps Meadows' son could locate the thousands of votes Trump would need to win the election. The text was described by multiple people familiar with the exchange. The jocular text message, which has not been previously reported, is one of many exchanges from the time in which Trump aides and other Republican officials expressed deep skepticism or even openly mocked the election claims being made publicly by Trump, according to people familiar with the investigation who spoke on a condition of anonymity. I mean, look, it's great that they're speaking on a condition of anonymity, but we have the text messages. You've now seen the text messages that Mark Meadows sent to the White House lawyer in late 2020, right before the January 2nd, 2021 call with Mark Meadows. Just to remind you, though, of the Mark Meadows situation, remember, at first, Mark Meadows was cooperating with the January 6th committee. He turned over about 2,000 text messages in October of 2021. He was then supposed to turn over the next tranche of records and text messages and be deposed by the January 6th committee on or around December of 2021. He said he was going to participate. He said he was going to turn over more records. But right before Meadows was set to actually sit for his deposition, Meadows filed a lawsuit against the January 6th committee and Nancy Pelosi and sought injunctive relief to try to block his testimony. Ultimately, that case was dismissed by a federal judge in Washington, D.C. However, Mark Meadows effectively ran out the clock on the January 6th committee, didn't turn over more text messages, didn't have to have his deposition taken. Many people were speculating, why did the Department of Justice not prosecute Mark Meadows, even though the January 6th committee recommended charges that be pursued by the Department of Justice for contempt of Congress? And remember what I had said at that time. I think the Department of Justice was going to try to focus on making Meadows a cooperating witness in connection with the broader criminal case that they were going to be prosecuting with respect to Donald Trump. And unlike the January 6th committee, that struggled when it came to executive privilege claims, because there is a small line of cases that basically say in an interbranch dispute that a former president could assert executive privilege vis-a-vis the Congress, but not vis-a-vis a current president. So the Department of Justice is an executive branch department, and the only person who could waive executive privilege is the current president, the current executive. So President Biden waived executive privilege. He's not asserting executive privilege. And even if President Biden were to assert executive privilege, if there was a compelling need that was showed by the Department of Justice, that would override any claims of executive privilege, even if it was asserted in the first place. So Biden has not asserted executive privilege. Mark Meadows has had to turn over the records that he didn't have to turn over to the January 6th committee. So Jack Smith's got those additional text messages right now. And we all believe that Special Counsel Jack Smith has turned Mark Meadows into a cooperating witness right now, that Mark Meadows has agreed to a proffer session providing all of this information to Special Counsel Jack Smith in exchange for either not prosecuting Meadows or for a lesser charge against Meadows. And all of the kind of MAGA world has not heard from Meadows. They're worried that Meadows has flipped, and by all accounts, Meadows is cooperating with Special Counsel Jack Smith right now. But as it relates to these specific text messages, we have reported on that here before on the MeidasTouch network, but this does go to show you that Special Counsel Jack Smith is very, very focused on this and messages like this, because it shows that everybody in Trump's orbit knew this was BS. They knew there was no election fraud. They were mocking it. Trump knew. And when Trump knew, that goes to intent. That's what's called the mens rea in a criminal case. And that's the type of smoking gun text messages that are going to be used in a prosecution of Donald Trump. Keep you posted as we learn more, but that's why we follow this step by step by step. I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network. Hit subscribe. We're on our way to 1.5 million subscribers thanks to your awesome support. Check us out at patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Wherever you get audio podcasts, subscribe to the MeidasTouch podcast. Have an excellent day.
At MeidasTouch, we are unapologetically pro-democracy, and we demand justice and accountability. That's why we're spreading our message to Convict 45. That's right, gear up right now with your Convict 45 tees and pins at store.MeidasTouch.com. That's store.MeidasTouch.com.